everyone, it is Thursday the 12th of June. Today the Women's Prize winner is announced, and about 8 hours ago I finished reading the Women's Prize for Fiction Shortlist. Remember, now there is also a Women's Prize for Non-Fiction Shortlist, and that's what I read last year, and hopefully next year I'll have enough time to read both. This year, a small book about tuberculosis kind of got in the way of a lot of my reading. I think I've read these all in about a week, maybe a week and a bit, and it's been a really fun sort of challenge for myself to do it, but it's been great reading them. This is the order that I read them in. So Safekeep first, then Good Girl, then All Fours, The Persians, Tell Me Everything, and Fundamentally. What I'm going to do in this video is take you through each of these books and what I thought of them, and then also say which one I think is going to win and which one is my favourite. And who knows if those are the same thing. But I'm going to start with the Safekeep. There was a theme, okay, across these books, and the theme was mothers, which I think is quite fitting for the Women's Prize, but it was really a theme. And I will say in advance, as you know, I talk about grief and I talk about parental loss a lot, and that's not a spoiler. Is that a spoiler? No, that's not a spoiler for these books, but it does come through very strongly. So if you're wondering, does the dog die.com, there is a lot of parental grief in this book, but I will talk about how the different ways that they're handled. So first I read The Safekeep, which I'd heard so many things about. In fact, like when I bought it, the bookseller said to me, "Oh, I love this book, can't wait to hear what you think." And when I showed it on my story, I think on Instagram, people responded like, "Oh, I love The Safekeep." And it was also, Women's Prize shortlisted, as you see here, but it was also shortlisted for the Booker Prize, 2024, because of the different timings of the prizes. And obviously very physically stunning book, has the beautiful tiles in the end papers, and just a book that is made with a lot of care. The Safekeep is set in the Netherlands in the 1960s and follows Isabel, whose mother has died, whose brothers are kind of off doing their own thing. One of them is dating a man and has kind of lived in a level of secrecy but not at the same time, and the other brother is constantly dating new women, but Isabel has no prospects and takes a lot of care of the family home, takes a lot of care of really her mother who has passed, her belongings, her way of running the house, like really sees that as her responsibility, and is quite rigid about it, I would say. But she meets, or her brother introduces her to his new girlfriend, Ava, who is really different from her, is very upfront, very kind of forward, but seems to have this slight double side to her where she can be very sweet and then be quite clever, I guess is the best word to use around Isabel. Ava ends up moving into the house with Isabel on their own. A recipe for disaster. This story is so beautifully crafted. It reminds me, and I say this in more words than kind of thematically, but it reminds me very much of the films Phantom Thread and Portrait of a Lady on Fire, in that they feel like paintings. The construction of this book felt like a painting. The different characters as well felt so distinct, and the home felt very real. And even though I don't know loads about the Netherlands in the 1960s, I just got a real sense of their world through Isabel's perspectives, and also kind of what you're learning about all the different characters. This was a really kind of fantastically executed book about national mythologies, many different kinds of return. So I think that there are books that are about departure, but this was about return. It's about time after, because it's only 15 years since the Second World War has ended. And it's also about a kind of return to self, like, not to give any massive spoilers, but a kind of softening of the self and the different ways in which we can soften and in that understand the reasons why we have maybe hardened. It sounds more sexual than I think it's more sexual than I meant it. But in that, it's a fantastic exploration of memory. I always really enjoy different kind of interrogations of memory, of secrets, of things that we do and don't tell. I think that's why I read so many stories around kind of families, and especially in Latin American fiction and magical realist fiction, where you have those generational stories as well. So much of that is what is and isn't told between those years. And about also magical objects. Like I love the sort of imbuing of an object with real magical kind of elements, if that makes sense. It's hard we're talking about this. I've forgotten how hard it is sometimes, like you don't want to spoil anything, but there is that just sense of like all of the things that are in this home have so much meaning and history, in the same way that I would say that so many things in my home have meaning and history. Like here's this bunny that Dodie knitted for me during the Panny D lockdowns. So many people told me how much I was going to love it, and I think that can be sometimes hard to contend with because you have that expectation in it, and in a way it was hard to let that disappear and just read the book. But I think it really was fantastic. It reminds me of books like Half of a Yellow Sun. It reminds me of The Goldfinch. I've already said Portrait of a Lady on Fire and Phantom Thread. Did I write? I think I might have written in a couple of others down. The Odyssey, just that little poem, The Odyssey. I really liked it, but it was also hard to know because it was the first one of the shortlist that I read, so I didn't really know where to place it for a bit. And also, it was interesting because it set my expectation, because I read it first, for what the rest of the books on the shortlist were going to be like. And actually, they were all quite different from this. I would say such precise storytelling in a very certain way. That's not helpful. Let's go into the next one. The next book I read was Good Girl, which follows Nila, who's 19 years old, living in Berlin, has grown up in Berlin. Her parents are from Afghanistan, and she has just lost her mother. Theme. She goes hardcore as a teenager. She's going to a place in Berlin called the Bunker, which is very much like Berghain. She parties and she takes loads of drugs and she like hooks up with different people, and she like has this intensity to her life, but also you see the intensity of her life just living as someone from an immigrant family in Berlin, in this like melting pot of a city, but to the point where like there's neighbours who draw swastikas on their front doors, like living down the corridor. There's just this kind of complete abandonment in a certain way of the district of the city where she lives, and this regard also for or like very low regard for that area, to the point that she lies to everyone she meets, and she says sometimes she's Greek, she says sometimes she's Italian, but she doesn't tell them that she's from Afghanistan. This is exacerbated by the fact that, and this is told kind of in retrospect, that she's sent to a boarding school because her behaviour is regarded as her parents by so bad, and they want to get her out of trouble. It's very much kind of set in the present of her life and the 19-year-old storyline, but I think it's very good at folding in these look backs at these very significant moments in her life and in her understanding of self, especially in context of what it means to be brown and living in Germany, what it means to be Muslim and living in Germany, and at the different times where there are so much racism and so much tension being stoked, so much anti-migration, I was going to say rhetoric, but it's like vitriol, I feel like is the more accurate way to say it, being shared, and but also you have this intensity because she falls for a guy he's not a good one. I would feel like it's not a spoiler to say he's not a great guy. He's in his 30s, he's American, reminded that she's 19 years old, and he's kind of known for philandering. He's had this big novel, this big success, but it's been some years since that happened. But she's completely intoxicated by him and very captivated by his presence. I absolutely adored Good Girl. I loved reading it after Safekeep because both books are very much about what comes after, and in this case being what comes after the Second World War and what it means to be in the Netherlands or in Germany after the Second World War. Like, what world do we build after the end of the world, but also how do we remember what happened? Like, how do we engage with that, interact with that, pretend it didn't happen, address it? In telling the story of her losing her mother, it also very much talks about the kind of loss in memory that happens to a nation in these kinds of like crises and in these moments of intensity. On a very personal level, for me, this book just writes so beautifully and brilliantly about grief, and grief when you're very young, because I lost my dad when I was 19, and that sense of like losing yourself and intentionally kind of giving parts of yourself away, but also this need to really maximize sensation, because so much of it can have a real numbing effect, and you want to feel something, like you want to feel something that isn't also this like numbing flat grief. And so I remember when I was 19, 20, 21, I would like drink loads, I'd go out loads, I'd make quite like I don't want to say reckless, but quite like intense decisions. And I was trying, it wasn't like I was trying to completely discard myself. I think there was a level of self-abandonment there, but there is a level of like trying to anchor in different places and find some firm footing in different ways, and through that find some, I don't know, purchase on the big rock of the world that has that you've been thrust onto when someone dies. I wrote a lot about like denial and self-refusal of the story, like what it means to be Afghan, what it means to refuse the I mean, I've spoken to a lot of people who've sought asylum who have refused the word refugee, who don't like the word refugee in their interaction with the word refugee, because it carries so much baggage. Like, what does it mean to be part of like the refugee class? What does it mean to then sometimes lose your specific identity and your specific story because you're just kind of assumed to be part of this whole? And I got quite frustrated because when I was I finished reading this and I went to Storygraph and was reading through reviews, and someone, this is no fault of their own, but they when they were reviewing it, they said, I really can't deal with these books about young women making stupid decisions, knowing they're stupid decisions, and then wondering why they are unhappy with their lives. And I felt very like defensive about that, probably as I say, because it's kind of personal to me. And I wrote, you want her to make different decisions, but also you know she won't, like she's hurting herself. But it was also a story of abuse and manipulation, how you see someone, adore them, are intoxicated by them, then see them for who they are. It's also a story about groups of friends and the people who come and go. The next book I read was All Fours by Miranda July. If you've read any Miranda July before, you know it's quite an experience. I'd read The First Bad Man when it first came out many years ago. I think I even talked about it on this channel. All Fours is the story about a woman who is known, semi-famous, for something that she does, and that's all kept quite vague, but it felt quite a nod to like Miranda, I feel weird calling her Miranda July's world. She's a mother of, I think the kid is about like 9 or 10, maybe a bit younger, and is married, and she has just received a solid chunk of money for some writing that she did that was picked up by a whiskey company or something like that. She decides that she's going to use it to go to New York and have a really lavish time in a hotel and go on a holiday kind of by herself. And that's kind of quite a big decision for her. She has some friends in New York that she's going to see. And then it's suggested to her, I think by her husband, that she drive across the country. I don't want to get into too much more than that because it does feel like it enters spoiler territory at that point. But let's just say that she makes a different set of decisions from that. And this is where I started to feel a little hypocritical about being annoyed at the Storygraph review that I just read out, because I found myself so frustrated with the protagonist's decisions in this book. It annoyed me so much. And I also remembered that I find reading marginalized writing quite stressful in a way that I think is intentional, like in a way that I think is part of the craft of what she's doing. But it really gets to me because I just find it so annoying because it's so like counter. I think this is ultimately the thing. That must be what the reviewer of the previous book was talking about. It's so counter to how I would do things. And I know that's why I read books, and that's why I enjoy these stories, because I want to see inside different people's lives and different people's ways of thinking about the world, ways of imagining the world and all of that, and that's all great. But then I read this and I just felt so frustrated. I think there's like a level of like simultaneous like decisiveness and indecisiveness, and indecisiveness does really get to me. It's I'm just like, make a decision. Make a decision, commit to it, do this, do that, do whatever. And obviously in a road trip you have like a journey. There is a kind of reluctance from the protagonist to undertake that journey, or I guess a what I would say is like a swerve on that journey, you know, like a left fork. So I was very stressed out, and I didn't know whether I could keep reading this book. About 100 pages in, I was still super stressed out, and I was just saying to people, I was like, maybe Miranda July is not for me. She's very funny, but her humour is just also like very different from my sense of humour. Like, it's not that it's like, she talks a lot about sex, and she talks a lot about kind of like the intricacies is like way too polite a word for it. Like, she talks a lot about holes, she talks a lot about liquids. She is not holding back from that, and it's not that that's like not my sense of humor, but it's just like, it feels like her goal as an author sometimes is to stress out, horrify and disgust, repeatedly use those techniques. This is what her internal world is, and it very much feels like autofiction at various points. I will say, as the novel goes on, like, I was really impressed with where this story goes, and especially where it lands in the last like 50 pages, because I thought it was just extremely beautifully done, and it was a really good reminder as well for me that, and you know, I know this, but like, I don't have to kind of adore a book and be fully on board to be able to really admire and respect what happens in it. And I'm really glad that this book exists, because I can also understand, having read the whole thing, why it feels so important to people. And I read a review of it that calls it like the perimenopausal book, which I just thought was quite funny. This is probably the only one on the shortlist that doesn't deal with the death of a mother, but in this, obviously, she is the mother, and she's trying to understand herself right now in her 40s. She's trying to see what it means to spend time with herself. She's trying to see what it means to spend money on herself, and what her relationships with her friends are, what her relationship with her husband's like, what's her relationship with love, with sex, with all of that. And so this was interesting for me in the context of the rest of the shortlist, because it felt very much like placing that conversation front and centre, but it also didn't feel like a lesson. Like Patrick Ness also says, like, people want to read a story, they don't want to read a lesson. That is one of the ways in which her like techniques, as I'm going to call them, are really effective, because they don't feel like lessons. Like, you definitely don't feel like you're being sort of lectured at any level in this situation while she's talking about holes. I was anxious when this came about. Said to myself, like, oh, I'll just make this in like 20 minutes, and already I've filmed for half an hour. The next book I read was The Persians, which follows an Iranian family, a pretty wealthy and like well-known by name Iranian family in Iran, but then they moved to America, and people don't know them and don't know why their name has value. They moved during the Iranian Revolution, but there are a couple family members who stay behind, and it's partly the distinction between life in America and life in Iran now, and also what it means to have like a powerful name when you go somewhere where that name doesn't necessarily have relevance. It's told between different perspectives of different family members, and it also begins in Aspen in Colorado, Aspen's in Colorado, right? Yeah, I think so. And in a scenario where one of the members of the family, one of the mothers in the family, spends lavishly and still lives a very kind of high life, has been arrested and has kind of been set up. And by kind of, I mean absolutely has been set up. So it follows the fallout of that, but also within it you get a lot of the family histories, and you understand the different family dynamics. I conceptually think that that's a banging idea, what it means to, again, bring your life and bring all these different levels and elements of your identity to a different country, and then having to engage with the ways in which that country does and does not care about those parts of your identity, and tries to give you new ones that you don't necessarily want to accept, or tries to trap you, or tries to include or not include. There's a son who goes by Nate now, and he's kind of like thought of as a bit of a joke by everyone, because like everyone's like, I'm not going to call you Nate, but there's also like a lot that is facilitated by the fact that they have so much money. I quite struggled with this one, to be honest. I think that the voices weren't distinct enough. I think when you're telling a story through multiple voices, those voices have to be very distinct, those characters have to be very distinct. And another thing that I really struggled with is the fact that the characters at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book don't seem to have moved very much between where they were. Like, I don't really feel like they've gone on much of a journey, and where they have made quite big decisions, I didn't feel like that was really kind of explored or interrogated. And it didn't have to be interrogated in a very like intense way, but it wasn't, it felt all a bit surface level for me, to be honest. And it just felt a bit clunky, and I was sad to say that. It's also published by like one of my favourite imprints, Fourth Estate, and so I was a bit like, oh, okay. I was just a bit sad about it, I think, to be honest. It reminded me of, when I was reading it, I was kind of also quite taken aback, because I was like, oh, this reminds me of Crazy Rich Asians. But I feel like Crazy Rich Asians like did this thing about like wealthy diaspora more effectively. And of course there is a dead mother in this. That is another element to the work, but that for me just felt a bit disconnected, and the choices her daughter makes as the book progresses in particular felt like they just didn't really make sense. And there were a couple of moments where I actively was like, oh, I just don't I don't get it. Like, I don't get what you're trying to say here. And sentence to sentence, I also just didn't really enjoy it that much. So I will say that this was one that I was like, oh, I wouldn't have shortlisted this one. I would have put my favourite book of last year, The Ministry of Time, on it. And there were a couple of others that I read on the long list that I maybe would have put on the shortlist instead of this one. But it was interesting that it was chosen. 2 more to go. The next book I read is Tell Me Everything by Elżbieta Strout. This is a library copy, so it's been hard read. I haven't read any of her other novels, and she writes about a character called Olive Kitteridge who lives in this town called Crosby in Maine. I did feel while reading this that the experience of reading the book would have been enhanced by like knowing all the lore, having read all the other backstories. Olive isn't like the centre of the story. She's just kind of a character who comes in at various points throughout. This is really not about Olive it is and isn't at the core. This is about Lucy and Bob. This is set early days after the lockdowns, or I don't know what they were in Maine, but kind of in those first couple of years after COVID first hit. And Lucy has moved to Crosby, the town in Maine, from New York, and kind of leaves that New York life for life in Maine. And then Bob has been there for a very long time. He's a local lawyer, and he and Lucy strike up a real friendship, and they go for walks, and Olive thinks that they're in love. They have a very open friendship with one another, and they both have different stories from their life that come up as they take these walks. I was going to say a breath of fresh air, but Bob uses it to sneak his cigarettes that he's told his wife Margaret he's definitely given up. And there's something very charming about this. It's not really the kind of book that typically I would gravitate towards, like small town American life is not really my kind of book. There is this like murder mystery element that does have this quite quiet propulsion, feels too strong, towing you a little bit along as you go throughout the course of the book, and unfolding all these other different mysteries in the town's inhabitants and their relationships to one another, and the loves and hatreds and tragic past, and histories of terrible things that have happened and so on. I don't really know what to say other than that. Like I found it charming, a very good writer. If you liked this, then definitely go in and read the other Olive Kitteridge books. This is me having not read any of the other ones, but I could tell that this is someone who knows what she's doing. The final book is Fundamentally by Nussaibah Younis, which also has a lot of fans, like authors like the Safekeep. It's definitely one that I've heard people be like, yeah, fundamentally. My brain's just gone. The story revolves around Nadia, who's an academic, and she goes to Iraq to take on this position with the UN, with this kind of fictitious branch of the UN called the UNDO. And her job is to essentially rehabilitate, or try this program, rehabilitating ISIS brides. The women who were manipulated, recruited, enthusiastically went to, etc., live with ISIS fighters. It's very contemporary. The story is told from Nadia's perspective. It's told in a very strong voice. Like, there was definitely voice there, voice for days. And it also shows a lot of the kind of shortcomings of that world of international aid, international humanitarian assistance, and these bureaucracies and the different things you have to get approval for, and the different ways in which you get approval, and how so much of that is connections, and it satirizes that quite brilliantly, I thought. But then the real kind of push of the story is when she does go to the camp and she meets the women, she connects very much with one of them, a girl called Sarah, who had moved and who grew up in the East End. So there's like that element to the story that like then I feel like the story really begins. Then her mission becomes to like help Sarah out. That's kind of like the overall arc of the story. But there's another element, is that her mum, Nadia's mum, disowned her when she was, I think, about 20, or like in that age group, like late teens, when she'd gone off to university. But then they have since like reconciled, but the relationship is tense. And so in that way, it fulfills the theme of the shortlist of mothers. She also has an ex, a recent ex called Rosie, who was kind of like her best friend and lover and partner in so many ways. And that's very much the situation that she's trying to escape that gets her to Iraq. There is also a recklessness to her. But I think the main story really does feel like it's about her and Sarah. Like it is this relationship with this person who she immediately connects with. I liked Fundamentally a lot. I did not love it. Like it wasn't one that for me I was like blown away by. It's one that I'm excited to talk to people about. I think it's a great book club book. But for me, it just didn't connect with me on like a character to person level in the same way that a couple of the other ones did. It's hard for me in all of this, and I'm going to put this book down now because it's not specific to Fundamentally, but it's hard for me in all of this to be like, and this happens when you have a favourite book of the year that doesn't get shortlisted, not to think like, I think Ministry of Time explores that so effectively, and I just wanted it to be nominated so bad. I really did. Like, I wanted it to be shortlisted. I love that book so much. There's a lot of kind of deep complexity about bureaucracy there, which I feel like felt a bit more surface level with Fundamentally. Even though, yeah, again, like it wasn't like that I think it's a bad book. I think it's great. It's just, it was explored, I think, more carefully in Ministry of Time, and in a way that I found personally more interesting. But that's just me. Okay, so those are my overarching thoughts. My personal ranking, my personal favourite is Good Girl, then The Safekeep, All Fours, Fundamentally, Tell Me Everything, and then The Persians. But my ranking in terms of what I think is going to win is actually quite a different one. I think it's All Fours, Safekeep, Fundamentally, Good Girl, Tell Me Everything, and then The Persians. I look forward to watching the live stream and finding out who the winner is tonight. But those are my thoughts. Those are my predictions. That's where I'm at. Yeah, what did you think? If you've read any of them, if you disagree wildly with me, I'm excited to hear. Please tell me more. Now I need to do a thumbnail.